by the middle of the 70s, I realized I needed to find a place for myself as a picture-making artist. For some reason, and I still can't really explain this reason, it seemed that, for me at least, it ought not to be painting, and it ought somehow to be photography. But photography practiced in what I would think of as a very focused relationship to my own previous attitudes and ideas about painting. I had known the work of the classic figures that we have a sort of a consensus about in photography, whether it was Walker Evans, Eugene Adjei, Robert Frank, Bill Brandt, etc. I wasn't motivated to do it or to follow their footsteps, partly because at pretty much the same time or soon after, new deployments of photography began to emerge in the new art of the 60s. And so I was really interested in what Robert Smithson was doing, for example, at that time, or Douglas Hubler, Dan Graham, and others who were using photography in a fresh way that had to do with wider concerns, or concerns that seemed wider than what the classical consensus was really focused on. Well, The Thinker is one of a pretty small number of pictures I made in direct relation to an existing artwork. I've done 3 or 4 of them. I can be affected by an artwork as much as I could be affected by an event I see. If I was looking at Dürer's monument that he designed for the end of the peasant revolts in the 1600s, that could just as much be an inspiration to me as anything else. I keep a freedom for myself to respond to anything I want. So because Dürer imagined a monument, and a monument that was never made, was never completed, there's a certain complete imaginariness about this whole theme. The suffering person with a knife in his back. Knife in the back always means betrayal. And that was, of course, what he was expressing at the time, the betrayal of the peasants. I didn't have any particular betrayal in mind in any historical sense. I just loved the motif and thought it could be applicable to anything. Betrayals happen in personal life, they happen in business, they happen in politics, they happen in all sorts of registers. It's a kind of a universal thing, like happiness and sadness, anger, and so on. Betrayal is almost a fundamental condition. So it seemed detachable from whatever he did, and could float free in my world. So, of course, I wanted to quote his picture quite directly, but place it in a now time. And the now time is now, of course, 40 years ago time. But it probably still has a sense of the now about it. That kind of project, that kind of idea, led to just another kind of expression that I thought I could make. The fact that he sits atop a hillside, on top of a hill, from which you can see, in a way, the panorama of a whole city. In this case, it's Vancouver, but I feel like it could be any city. I like that it suggested the comprehensive, overarching content of whatever is in his mind, because he's experiencing and contemplating something that's happened to him. And I wanted his thoughts to be large, not contained, but to expand. And I was very happy to photograph in the summer with a completely blue sky, which has this infinite expanse, as if there's no limitation, there's no border to the thought that could be generated by this experience. The whole process of undergoing in that period in the 60s and 70s a kind of doubt, rethinking, experimentation, evolution that I went through, not only changed my relation to the picture-making tradition, but revealed something to me about myself, about my own personality and what kind of an artist I would be, and therefore, of course, what kind of a person I could possibly be. And unpredictably, I suppose, or partly unpredictably, it kind of led me to this new relation to picture making that had to be done in a kind of almost exile relation to painting, an intensely exiled or intensely reflective relationship to painting without in any way ever attempting to imitate painting or do photographs as if they were paintings. It was clear that the picture-making process that had come down for several centuries would go on as painting in the hands of those who wanted it to, in the hands of those who were probably going to be good at it, who felt they would be good at it. For some reason, I must have thought I wasn't going to be good enough at that. I wouldn't satisfy myself at that, and that it revealed that I had a relationship to photography that I hadn't suspected before. And in discovering that relationship, that personal relationship to photography, that allowed me to have the freedom in a way to reinvent photography for myself and reinvent the way photography could be made. Most of the time, something in the subject refuses to be contained in one image. I prefer to make single images. It's the most economical and in a way most satisfying, in a way pure pictorial form is the single picture that does what it does. But paradoxically or surprisingly, sometimes I'm working on something that just keeps pushing away from being contained in a single frame. But in the case of actor in two roles, it's different. The theme, if you want to call it that, the starting point is very, very simple. And I think a lot of the so-called subjects of my pictures are very, very simple. And I like their simplicity. I don't want them to be popular. I just like them to be kind of elemental, shall we say. An actor is somebody who becomes different people. And it's sometimes really amazing how different actors can look in different roles. Even though you really know them and they're even famous movie stars, you surprise yourself sometimes how they can change their appearance. So that change of appearance just became a fascination, and I thought I would like to do something about it. I realized that in order to perceive the change of appearance, the actor would have to appear twice. When I began to work on it, I realized that the performance would have to be a play and not a film or a TV show or something. Or a film, we'd have all this equipment, cameras and lights and things in the way, and it would distract from the pure performance. Whereas in theater, you have none of that, and you can simply look directly at the performance. Moreover, it had to be in a certain kind of theater, a small one, because if it were in a large theater, no matter how big the photo I printed, the actors would still be small, too small, because if we were trying to show the stage of a large theater, you see the problem. So it had to be in a small theater. Well, there is in every city a world of small theater, little theaters that put on low-cost productions and experimental plays sometimes, and so on. So I worked with that world of little theater, found two small theaters, and searched for actual plays that were being put on at the time I was working on the picture or around that time. I wanted them to be new plays or recent plays that could really be seen in theaters somewhere. And I researched a lot of theaters around the world, looking at their repertoires and finding out about what they were producing. And I chose the two plays you see here because they were so different from each other. One, as you can see, is in a way a very almost experimental play where there's no set. It's a black stage. The other play is a much more conventional play where there's an imaginary world, more or less realistically depicted, and so on. And I wanted the two plays to be different enough that that was itself a point of interest in the pairing. And basically, I engaged actors from a theater and a choreographer and so on to stage the plays, because I'm not a theater director. I don't really know how to put on a play and work with actors. That's not what I do. I'm not a director. And when I needed a director, I hired one. Some people call my work stage photography, but I don't like the term because that implies that they're done in relation to the stage as an institution, the theater as an institution, and I don't do that. And also I don't direct because I don't know what that is, and the work I do with people I photographed isn't directing, even though sometimes I'm telling them carefully what I want them to do. I'm not directing them the way a theater director would be doing it, or a film director. It's just not the same. I can't really go into detail about why it isn't, but partly, of course, is I'm only directing them for a fragment of a second. So in this case, I let others do the staging and recorded it as I recorded the part I want. In essence, I produced about 20 or 30 seconds of two plays and photographed a 250th of a second of that 20 seconds. But for that 20 seconds, there were really plays going on the stage. So in that sense, these are documentaries of a stage production that could easily have taken place.
E convinha alguém para segurar as pontas, que é para depois enrolar.
Não, isso nós fazemos. Normalmente temos que fazer.
Deu? Ok, 3. Vai além. Tá.
When I began to move toward a starting point for another engagement with the picture-making process or tradition, the essential groundwork for that was my apprehension of the importance of the tableau form. In English, we don't really have a word that translates tableau from the French. Tableau in the French tradition suggests something more emphatic than just a picture. It's a specific picture that had been derived from Western painting over many centuries, a picture that emphasized its own presence, its own making, its own design, its own complexity, and its own physical presence. And that tableau confronted the viewer with some emphatic statement of visual actuality. That was the fundamental context in which I thought I could evolve some photographic process for myself, to make some kind of tableau form by using photographic technology. That also opened up the question of how one starts to make a photograph. In the Orthodox tradition, photographers generally acted as if they were photojournalists and went into the world to capture actuality as it occurred, and in that process, managing to compose their pictures in such a way that the picture itself transcended the photojournalistic moment and became an autonomous composition that could be appreciated for its aesthetic qualities, just as a painting or drawing could. So composition and all of that was inherent in traditional photography, but it was subdued by what I think of as the orthodoxy of having to capture the real as such, and that being the only legitimate starting point. But the tableau form itself includes any number of kinds of pictures, imaginary scenes, realistic scenes, and anything in between. And that made me realize that there was a possibility that a more open field of inauguration, a more open way of starting a picture was available just by means of paying attention to that phenomenon and that tradition. So the tableau as a ground to stand on opened the door to the possibility of making photographs in any number of ways. And in that sense, there was an imitation, or at least a new relationship to another important tradition, and that was the cinema. And so the term cinematography, which I began to use after making 5 or 10 pictures in the 70s, 80s, I understood that the cinema contained a way of doing photography that exactly mirrored or exactly complemented what I had been just thinking about in terms of the tableau. Films are made from any number of scenarios, any number of styles, manners, etc. And the same filmmaker might make vastly different films on different occasions. That suggested a kind of artistic freedom that I wanted, but also a freedom that wasn't really allowed for in the classic consensus about what was important in photography. So I realized I had to break from that and find a way to integrate a kind of a wider sense of what was possible, at least potentially what was possible in the process of making pictures. So the tableau and the cinematographic were kind of a dual framework in which this, what I think of as an expansion of some of the potentials of photography, was going to be possible. Some beans and an octopus were made in the cellar of a building I had just acquired to be my first studio. And it's a very old building, I still have it. And I was fascinated by the cellar, of its color and its old materials and the combinations of things that didn't explain themselves directly. And I wanted to find a way to photograph the space just as simply as possible. I also found the 2 tables that are in the picture down there. They had been left by the former owner. And just the 2 tables began to interest me, and I placed them and then I moved them a little, and then I realized they weren't quite the same height. And if you look carefully, you'll see under the legs, there's some little shims that I put under to try and get the 2 tables to be exactly the same level, and they are. So I had the 2 tables the same level, and I thought, well, that's nice. I have now a continuous plane and another plane of the wall, and I have this and I have that and all the elements of a picture, but what do I do now? And I thought, well, tables are where still lifes happen. People put apples and things on tables and they paint them or whatever. And I thought, yes, I guess I could have a still life. So I thought, well, still lifes are usually food of some sort, like apples, but I don't want to do apples. What should I do? And it came to mind I could do a frozen octopus. I won't try and explain it. It just seemed like a fascinating object, and I could see them in a market. So I got a frozen octopus, and I photographed her. And I photographed the octopus as it was thawing. So what you see there is an octopus that is already not frozen anymore. So I did that picture, and in the process I realized I needed, if I was going to have something on the other side, which wasn't definite, what could it be? And somehow an octopus was here, and then beans was over here, around some sort of a sphere of thing, food or something. And so I found a few beans, and I laid them out on the table, and I photographed them. And I realized I had 2 pictures. I didn't think that it would be interesting to have the octopus and the beans in the same room at the same time. It's as if only one of those entities could be in that room at that time. And so the picture became 2. 2 tables became 2 pictures. Each picture had to have something in it. It was a sort of a process of, what would you call it? So like writing a haiku or something. Just finding the parts that seemed to go.
Mas eu acho mesmo que esta suavidade parece-me que não interfere muito, porque sei lá, entendes?
My sense of scale in my work derives from the phenomenon of the tableau, the picture that confronts us physically from its place, and which marks itself off as a distinctive visual phenomenon with its own autonomous character. The history of painting shows us that this tableau can appear in any scale, in any size, from the gigantic to the rather modest. That thought in itself opened up my thinking about photography because, due to the inherent possibilities of enlargement which have existed for most of the history of photography, there is no fixed scale range of scales that is acceptable or superior or more fundamental than any other. Again, the classical tradition didn't pay much attention to enlargement because of its relationship to publications and the page, so small prints were perfectly adequate, and there wasn't a lot of impetus to look further afield because there were no formats or frameworks or occasions in which a larger image was needed. But the tableau requires an open treatment of scale. And if you're attuned to that, you realize that there are certain virtues and advantages in making pictures at different sizes. In the history of the Western picture, in the history of the formation and evolution of the tableau, there is really only one objective scale, or one objective moment of scale, and that is life scale. Life scale in a picture is the fact that objects in that picture are rendered the same size as they would be if we saw them in the room in which the picture is hanging. Life scale replicates real scale, the scale of the universe. It's objective and it can be recorded and reproduced photographically or by any other pictorial means. All other scales are scalings up or scalings down of life scale. So there's something special about life scale within the tableau tradition. Not to say that all tableaus are the best tableaus, the best pictures are made in life scale, but to say that life scale is the inherent inner measure, often unacknowledged inner measure of the size of any picture. I think I was drawn to it just personally by my personal preference for the way I see, and of course by my excitement at seeing many, many pictures in paintings that had that vivid lifelikeness, almost living quality that they have, because we are seeing whatever is in them, almost as if we're seeing it in real life. I don't work in life scale all the time, and I don't think it's better than any other scale, but it is a particularly exciting one, and it's suitable for a lot of the kinds of pictures I've wanted to make. When I'm thinking about the possibilities of some starting point I might have, I almost always at least consider whether that subject should appear at that universal scale. Gardens is probably the single biggest object I've made, even though it's composed of 3 parts. I wanted to photograph these 3 lovely gardens, which are on an estate outside of Torino, in Italy, which I discovered with my wife on a tour. But I felt that the garden photos themselves wouldn't be worth doing because they wouldn't be as good as the gardens themselves, and they would just be kind of pretty landscapes in a way, or beautiful landscapes. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I tend to find a way to bring the 3 together in a more compelling way, at least for myself. So I forced myself to invent an occurrence, or a set of occurrences that could possibly be happening in these gardens. And I sort of invented a scenario, which is something I don't usually do. My pictures all have subjects, but they don't really have scenarios. A scenario suggests an evolution of a story in time, and I don't do that. I don't need to do that. But in this case, I sort of did need to do it in order to bring the pictures together in some way. So I did invent a scenario, and I won't try and narrate it to you because it would take too long, but it's there, and it does occur in a time sequence from left to right, which is also something else that I've never done before and maybe will never do again. And it does involve a certain number of people interacting in certain ways. The gist of it is in order to understand the people's experiences or what they're doing and going through, we need to be able to see those people clearly. They can't be too small, otherwise we wouldn't be able to make out their expressions and understand their gestures and even identify them very well. So the picture was, the size of each of these pictures was set by the minimum size the figures could be to be comprehensible in the way that they needed to be pictorially effective and compelling. And the picture grew, in a sense, or got sized on that basis. And because I wanted to include a lot of the garden, because they're such interesting places, and the kind of lushness and complexity of the gardens themselves are part of the story, if you want to call it that, you see that the pictures would have to be the size they are in order for us to actually see those people. Subject is a something that I feel will lead to the making of a picture. Therefore, it's nothing more nor less than a starting point, the beginning of a picture-making process. And that starting point can be suggested to me by more or less anything. And when I began to use the term cinematography, it referred or expressed that freedom, that openness. I wanted to appropriate that freedom for the making of the kinds of pictures I want to do. And so what that meant was that anything that occurred to me, whether it was something I witnessed or something I heard from someone, something I read about, or an errant daydream of my own, any of those things could be valid or useful as an occasion to make a picture. Once I've agreed with myself that the starting point is something that I'm confident in, I can set the subject aside in a way, not think about it in terms of its meaning or any of its implications outside of the strict art-making process, and just focus on it as an occasion for the kind of plastic making activity, almost a formal making activity of a picture. So the subject goes away to some extent in that process, and in the process, its subjectness becomes less important than its pictureness. The picture-making potential of that starting point comes to the fore, and that, I think, creates a freedom, a free and mobile space for me to work only on the picture aspect of the subject. So, assuming the picture gets completed successfully, my hope is that the sheer pictureness of it, that the visuality of it, the composition of it, and so on, will bring the subject back somehow, bring it back to life, a life it's sort of lost to some degree in the picture-making process. The final result will bring that subject back again and make it available and seeable to other people. What I usually think about is the fact that the subject seems to interest me, but beyond it interesting me, is it really something that needs to be turned into a picture? And that's a process that's different each time, and it's often hard to explain it in any clear way. When I made The Storyteller, which was almost 40 years ago now, I was thinking about the subject in a way that I might not think about it today. I had seen something resembling what you see in the picture. And I guess it's a notion that people would be relating to each other by talking rather than by reading print or listening to media, that they would be relating in a direct way like that. Probably caught my attention as a sort of an alternative to, let's call it, the mainstream way of looking at things or dealing with things. And that anomaly or difference probably made me think that it was revealing an aspect of the world that it might be good to pay more attention to. Storytelling in the indigenous tradition has its meanings. They're not necessarily my meanings. I'm not part of it. But it intrigued me, and the fact that different cultural times could coexist in the same city, in the same world, also seemed to be a kind of a rich theme. So that's where it began, with those kind of thoughts. So once I kind of get to the point of admitting that there's something more to the subject than my own personal interest in it, then I will set out to make a picture of it. And that becomes a different process. I didn't really identify anything much with the original experience of talking that I did see. I didn't like where it was. It didn't seem to do anything that led me anywhere. So as I've said many times, I feel quite free to reinvent the picture part of my subject for myself. I don't do my pictures as a kind of documentation, so I don't feel obligated to record what was my original experience, because I think the re-experience and the recreation has its own validity. But then it also creates a new phase, which is the picture-making phase. The picture-making phase for me is to find a place that seemed to disclose something about the subject, and of course to find people who will do it, collaborate with me, and do what I want them to do. And that's what I did, essentially, is found the place I knew very well already for many years, and found the people through one of several different processes I can use to find people, get them interested in it, and find a way to collaborate with them, and compose the picture. Because I think the biggest task for me of the picture was composing it, finding a way to represent that place. Because the place itself is full of energy and history and beauty. And that, I think, adds to the subject. So the subject of the storytelling is important, but I think the place in which it takes place, gives it another level or another dimension of importance that may fascinate people who aren't even interested in the main subject. I think it's quite fascinating that people can like pictures about things that don't interest them. And I don't feel that any of the subjects of my pictures need to interest anybody. They just have to attract their attention and provide them some sort of enjoyable experience that may then the experience of the picture might bring to life the subject in some different way. That was my work.
Depois, antes de fechar, tirar um pra gente.
2, 3, sobe. Ok?
The Flooded Grave is one of a fairly limited number of pictures that had their origin in something completely imaginary, not something that I could have ever witnessed. I've done a few of them, and there's some in the exhibition. Not many, but I do them, or I feel I can do them, because I wanted to have the same kind of freedom in making pictures with photography as any artist would have in any other medium. I felt that photography was a complicated medium, a complicated technology, a complicated phenomenon that had the capacity to do the kind of things that the other arts did, and I just had a feeling that that was something I could enjoy doing and maybe accomplish something with. So I let myself be open to the idea that something like a daydream or a intuition or something like that could be the origin for a construction, a picture construction. And I wanted that because I felt like, and I still do feel, that essentially what I do is compose. I bring things together or order them visually to make a composition that is somehow inherently enjoyable to look at. So somehow I had the daydream, I think, as I said before, that I might have been, or someone might have been having a walk in a cemetery. You might be walking your dog. And in cemeteries, you do find holes that are open for the next burial. Maybe they're in process, they aren't finished yet. They may be about to be finished in the next hour. You can't really tell from my picture. And an imaginary passerby, who could be me, it could be anyone, stops to look into the hole on this rather wet day, and instead of finding the muddy water that you'd expect to accumulate it in their head, in their imagination, for only maybe a flash, they think of the ocean. They don't know why, I don't know why, but they do. And that's what happened to me, or at least that's what occurred to me, and I felt that there was something kind of fascinating there that said something about life and death and so on. The whole picture is based on the blending of two worlds. So this imaginary person, or this person who's doing the imagining, is imagining two places at the same time. Pictorial construction, pictorial making is such an open and vast field of possibilities, styles, approaches, etc., that on the structural level, on the fundamental level, it doesn't need to change very much in order to develop and grow. It doesn't need to change structurally very much. A picture tends to be what it is structurally, whilst allowing anything and everything to become a picture. So the constant flow of different ideas, themes, attitudes, approaches, styles, techniques, etc., that one can get involved in leads to the making of different sorts of pictures over time. And I've tried to make different sorts of pictures and tried to make each one of them rather singular, that is, unique in its own basic contents, its color, its composition, its theme, its treatment, its rendering of things, atmosphere, time of year, time of day, colors, things, what I'm looking at, where I'm standing, and so on. All those things keep reinventing themselves every time a new subject comes up, and the subject itself contains the potential for a new look at all of those things. And that doesn't tend to change very much. That's partly because of the equipment we use, cameras and lenses, which tend to have a very specific way of making things look, of rendering things, and that equipment does create boundaries to any differences that one could want to achieve. I'm quite happy with the way the camera sees the world. I've tried myself to see the world the way a camera sees it, so I'm quite happy with that and don't feel that it's constraining me in any way. So on that level, I don't think that there is really much room for the kind of profound underlying innovation that a painter might achieve by changing styles and changing manners. The only real transformation on the technical base, on the structural base of my work was the coming of digital technology in the early 90s. That allowed me to do one fundamentally different thing, which was to create a final image by combining elements on different individual pieces of film. Before that, anything that I and anyone else captured photographically was captured in a single moment on a single frame or sheet of film. That's fundamental to the magic of photography, but it's also kind of a limitation in the sense that the capturing of an event is contingent. That contingency can come into conflict with the urge to compose, and that conflict was something I was always very aware of. I liked very much getting a picture on one piece of film, and I still do it, but I also like the idea of the freedom to combine pieces of film to compose. Digital technology allowed me to do that, to split the capture, or to multiply the individual captures and combine them in a way that was more satisfying to me than they might have been otherwise. So since the beginning of the 90s, a lot of my pictures are not strictly speaking photographs anymore, because they are compositions made from more than one photograph, so they're technically photomontages. Recovery, in a way, is the simplest montage I've ever made, because it's really made out of two photos. the photo I made of the painting and the photo I made of the young man who apparently is part of the painting. There's only the two negatives, whereas other montages of mine can have 50 negatives in them or more. But that's all I needed in this case. All I wanted to do was create this phantom or phantasmatic image of the world as if being perceived for a moment by a young man who had suffered some sort of accident. We don't know what it is, and it probably wasn't even serious. But for some reason, he may have fallen down because he's sitting, and possibly he even lost consciousness. And I thought, if something happens to you that causes you some sort of illness, distress, or something like that, and then you are freed of it, cured of it, let's say, recover from it, there's an instant where you feel internally grateful to be well again. And at that moment, you might have the fantastic sense that there's something perfect about the world. This world that he's apparently seeing is sort of ephemeral. It's not really there. And photographs are always volumetric. They always show you the mass of things, the weight of things. And that seemed to be inappropriate. I wanted to lift it off into a kind of vaporous world of non-being, but brilliantly gleaming and calm and bright and warm. And so I realized it had to be some sort of graphic image. And then it reminded me of beautiful paintings in the past that had been painted for centuries of, utopian phantom worlds of classical beauty or total serenity or heaven or whatever it might be that is better than the world that we actually live in, a kind of ultra-pastoral sense of wellness and so on. So I thought, well, it has to be some sort of version of that, but not a very professional version, because the painting must be being done by the boy. It's in his head. You're sort of seeing what he's feeling, and he's feeling it only for probably an instant. And so I had to design a style in order for this painting, and that's what I did. Sort of designed it as I thought it would have to look, and then I just painted it in using a kind of a style related to things like Matisse or groovy rock records from the 70s, and things like some combination of graphic art, popular art, high art, that would give a sense of just a kind of unreal well-being. I hide the joins between my pictures and I photograph in order to conceal the joinery between the different captures. That's because my fundamental devotion or commitment or interest is still toward this unified image in a way that's given to us by lens perspective, which of course is a version of eyesight. My fascination with eyesight has determined for me the fact that my photo montages should be invisibly made, so the experience of my work is still the experience of a single picture, single moment, even though that's kind of an illusion.